All right, hi everyone. My name is Samantha Phillips. I'm one of the organizers of the Computational Social Science Seminar here in S3D. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited to introduce our speaker today, who is a CMU alum, kind of a fun thing. So he is currently an assistant professor at University at Buffalo, where in the computer and engineering department, as well as director of the Computation and Equity Lab there. He got his PhD here at CMU with Kathleen Carley, my advisor, in societal computing, and then went and did a postdoc at Northeastern. And today he's going to talk to us about social identities on social media, and yeah, really excited for it.
Thank you,
There you go, Kenny.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. This can be very, I don't know, I guess it's like in theory formal, but very informal. Raise your hand or just yell at me. I don't need to get through all this stuff. As Sam said, I wasn't here in 2016. I was over there. But I don't know, kind of feels like not a lot has changed. But certainly some things have. So this is where this is Ween Hall. I'm lying with this circle. I was like over here, but I was happy. I found this picture with like the parking lot. This is how it looked when I got here in like 2010. I tried. Also, I looked up the reviews of Ween Hall. This was like where I found the picture. It's like some people like it for the turtles. Some people hate the bathrooms. But like, I tried to get over there to take a then and now picture, but I got lost in one of the many new buildings that are here since I have left. This is like artist rendition of what it looks like over there now. So that was happening. They were literally building the building like into the office walls when I was there. So they were like steel on concrete, which stunk. So ISR gave us these headphones that I have, actually still have at home. So it was like, well, they're putting steel into concrete outside your office, but like, here's some noise canceling headphones, which we actually really appreciated. So some things have changed here in terms of me. It took me 6 years to get a logo and a lab together, but I finally did it. I now, I guess, direct the Computation and Equity Lab at UB. Quite a bit of our work is actually in the context of child welfare, and so that's stuff that I won't talk about today, thinking about like how child welfare works, how people allocate services, what's got to change there. We do some simulation work, looking at, for example, gender in organizations, and do some like really fun teaching stuff. So I'm happy to kind of talk more about like what that looks like at a sort of large state school. Today I'm going to talk about this question of like how we measure identity and attitude through the lens of self-presentation, right? Self-presentation is sort of a strategic behavior, so people are trying to do things that we don't necessarily know about on social media, right? They want to have a goal in mind on social media, and we are trying to study things that are affected by those goals. And so the question is kind of like, how do we do that? Where I'm going to start today is really like, first, like why do we want to do that? I think it's a worthwhile question to kind of remind ourselves of, like, why do we want to measure in general? And why do we want to measure identity and attitude specifically? And what is it about computational methods on social media that's like helpful for that purpose? Okay. Then I'm going to talk about kind of like two, so this is sort of one study. This is a collection of a bunch of studies on bios, and then I'll sort of close out with some stuff. So starting with this, why do we measure? Like, I think it's important to note that this is like a valid question, right? So Maria Rodriguez is someone who I work quite closely with at the University of Buffalo. Her argument in the context of race and child welfare, where we think a lot is like, we know that child welfare is a racist system, like we don't need another study that measures that. Like, let's just go fix the problem. And so I just want to validate that, like, that's a view that's out there, and I think it's like a valid perspective, right? But nonetheless, I'm going to talk about measurement. So obviously, I think there's a purpose there. I think the purpose is that we measure to know and we measure to show. Right? So we measure to know what if we change something, for example, whether or not it worked, right? How big is this problem? What can we do to change things, right? In the context of identity and attitudes or beliefs and behaviors, right? So like, if we're trying to change behavior, we know that identity and attitude or belief are antecedent to that, or sort of co-evolve with it. And so if we want to understand how to change behavior, we have to, one valuable thing to do is to sort of understand identity and attitude in that space, right? We measure to show, so we're trying to convince people of other things, right? So like, look, here is a big problem, or look, here is the percentage, as we'll talk about later, of people who have political signifiers in their bios, right? So we want to be able to expose or think about the problem. This is like, for example, I want to show you how much snow we get in Buffalo. That's my kid, and that is indeed like they are the same height. That was a snowstorm from last year, which is maybe a bad time to pitch that ICWSM is in Buffalo this year. And you should all come. This is what Buffalo looks like in the summer. So there's a reason it's not in January. We're gonna have some fun. Buffalo's fun for a couple of days. So anyone who is thinking about coming, I'm happy to pitch you on the things that we can entertain you with for a couple of days. Okay, so that's why we measure. Why do we measure using computational methods and social media data? I will run through this. I think people here are sort of largely on board with that idea. We can do it to correct bias measures, to dig deeper, although I'll put an asterisk there because I think deeper in some senses and less deep in others. And the two that I'm going to talk about today, we can create new avenues for measurement, right? So we can take like an old way of measuring something, say an attitude, and a new way, and say like, how do these two things compare? What does that tell us? And we can find new ways of measuring things that we've really wanted to measure for a long time, but haven't necessarily had the ability to do. Okay. So like correcting bias measures, just quickly, like this is like the Gelman Xbox study, right? I think this is like a canonical example of like how we can use better stats to sort of correct certain measures with different kinds of data. If we want to dig deeper, we can say not necessarily like how did news coverage of COVID change over time as like a single statistic, but we can like whatever, do some topic modeling and dig further there, right? I think the catch is like sometimes we get stuck on like just doing topic modeling and saying that's enough. I would argue, right, like qualitative work for me has become increasingly important. Like I don't think there's a substitute to actually like going and reading 1,000 posts. So thinking about like how do we combine these things is something that we're sort of actively thinking about, and I suspect a lot of you are as well. But today, again, I'm going to focus on these sort of last two pieces, right? So the first part of this talk is really going to be about taking an old way of studying attitude surveys, taking a new way, behavior on social media, and saying how do those two things compare. And the second is to think about new ways of measuring old things. So how do we measure identities and their meanings in a different way? Okay, so this is work with a bunch of folks at who were at Northeastern. Some of them are now elsewhere. And the concept here is we have known that surveys can be used to measure public opinion for a long time. Many of us have also thought about how do we measure attitudes using social media data. There's been quite a bit of work that has compared sort of aggregate survey data with aggregate social media data. What we want to do is look at the individual level. So if you take a person and you ask them a survey question, and then you go look at their social media feed and you compare those two things, what do you say on a survey versus what did you say on social media, how well do those two things line up? So the data we're using from the COVID states project, so this is a big survey data set that was collected during COVID, but also after the sort of like main waves of COVID, I guess. There were a bunch of people. We asked them to give us their Twitter handle. There was about 8,000 people who did. And then we used just keywords from a different paper that those folks had written to pull out tweets about lockdowns, masks, Trump, and vaccines. Okay, so we have survey questions that are related to these things, and now we have like keyword-based searches for tweets that are related to those things. We're going to subset our analysis to people who have both answered the survey questions and people who have tweets about these things. Okay, so how do we compare? We're going to compare basically on like for, neutral, against. So computationally, this is stance detection. Except we're not going to run a model. We're actually just going to like manually label the survey data. And moreover, we're not going to farm it out to Prolific or anything. We actually did this ourselves, right? So like, I don't know, probably Prolific, people on Prolific, some of them are probably better than us at certain tasks. But the reason we ultimately ended up deciding to do this is there's some element of quality control here. And there's also, there's some element of quality control here, and there's also like privacy concerns that we had, right? So this is like the linking in particular, so we went back and forth, but ultimately we had 5 trained human coders, 2 on each of these, and a third for disagreement. Okay, so this is like our social media measure of your attitude towards those 4 different topics. And then on the survey, the intuition would be like, oh, you have 4 topics, you ask just, are you for or against this thing, right? But like surveys are really hard to do that kind of thing, right? So like for political candidates, we know how to do that, except it changes, right? So like some of our data was before the election, some of it was after, and so you end up with like who do you think you're going to vote for versus who did you vote for. But for things like lockdowns, it's actually quite difficult, right? There's different facets of lockdowns, and you can be sort of for some of them and against others. And so I'm going to sort of preface some of the later results with like this idea in stance detection that we can say like you're for or against lockdowns is like actually quite tricky, right? Because it's very easy to be for parts of lockdowns and against others. Okay, so we have now, regardless of those concerns for a second, we have like, are you for, neutral towards, or against these 4 different things on the surveys? And in the social media data, we're comparing just like what the same person said on those 2 things. Okay, so audience participation. Of the cases where survey respondents provided a neutral response for any outcome, how many of those, what percentage of the people who provided a neutral survey response across all topics tweeted something that was neutral? Someone give me a number.
20%.
20%. Okay. Any other ideas? Guesses? Higher, lower?
Lower.
Lower. Okay. What's the intuition there?
I think we believe that we are neutral, but in reality we are not.
Okay. Cool. So that's
When we
like
are asked directly, we say, oh, we are neutral, but practically it's another.
okay. That's interesting. Actually,
Why
yeah. So
would
like
we?
even if you think you're being neutral, you might not be. I thought
Is neutral the same as indecisive?
sure. I think that that's reasonable. What percent would you think would tweet about being indecisive? About lockdowns, mass, Trump?
Or rather, like, they might not have one particular sway or the other, they just refuse to pick. But as soon as they like actually get into the situation, they might actively pick one side or the other.
Yeah.
I feel like there might be a
Number
little
though?
bit difference there.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair. Any number you would guess? All right, so why don't I move to the next one? Of the people who gave a pro-Trump survey response, they said they were intending to vote for Trump or did vote for Trump, what percent tweeted content that we, the authors of the paper, labeled as pro-Biden?
Low percentage.
Well,
10%.
Give me a number. 10, 5. Roughly there. What about vice versa? Tweeted pro-Trump content, but were pro-Biden on the survey.
Similar number.
Negative 40%, right? Yeah. Okay. So here's the numbers. There was almost no one who tweeted a neutral statement when they provided a survey response that was neutral. The intuition here, actually, again, like that could be an alternative explanation that I admittedly had not accounted for, which is like maybe us as annotators just infer neutrality. Infer non-neutrality where there is an intention of neutrality. But I think the other sort of explanation that we have is like, who just tweets like, I don't know if I like mass. Like, you don't do that. That's not what social media is for, right? These numbers I think are maybe a bit more surprising. So like 3 in 10 of the people who gave a pro-Trump survey response tweeted pro-Biden content. What? And even some people who were pro-Biden on the survey tweeted pro-Trump content. Okay, so do I have a slide? Okay, so there's some more details here. Like some of them were harder, right? So lockdowns were actually quite a bit more difficult to like line up. And again, because I think the concept is much more difficult. Like being for or against a lockdown is like quite hard. We saw a lot of people, for example, who are sort of generally pro-lockdown, but really didn't like having their kids at home for 6 months. And like, as someone who had a 2-year-old at home for 6 months, like I get it. Right, I kind of already talked about this. So there is some nuance here. That's interesting. But the I think question I want to talk a little bit more about is like, well, what's going on here, right? Does anyone have any ideas besides when you presented about like mechanisms here?
Social desirability in the survey response.
Yeah. Well, yes, I would agree. Yes, I think that. Yes.
I wanted to ask, what's the demographics of the people that did the survey?
That's a good question. I think I'm gonna have it in a backup slide. It was predominantly white, but I think it matches sort of like the biases that you would get in most surveys in this context.
Or like
So,
maybe
like-
what occupations or stuff that they are doing? Because I would say that your previous slide on the 30% and 10%, it could also be predated by the person's environment. Like for example, if you were in our group and we are always studying like Trump and the Capitol riots as a bad thing, chances are you're not going to reply to the survey that I am pro-Trump.
Sure, right.
Right?
Yeah, and I think that lines up with kind of social desirability bias to a certain extent. So I'll give kind of two thoughts. I think the one that we sort of immediately thought of is time. So like it could be the case, and indeed it was the case, that people took the surveys earlier on. Why do you do surveys? You do surveys to understand public opinion when you don't already know it. So it's not like super useful after. It's useful in after the elections to sort of see who voted for Trump, so you can sort of condition on that when looking at other things. But like, we no longer care at that point to like measure your attitudes there in the sense that like the election's already happened, right? And so sort of the purpose, and sometimes the purpose of the survey is sort of different than the purpose of social media, which is to express the things that you care about, right? So time was definitely a factor. You could also say like, well, maybe you were pro-Biden and then you switched to Trump, right? I think we know empirically that's not super likely, but maybe it's like a biased candidate pool. But what we find is like time can't really explain everything. So the gist here is like the consistency, this is like the consistency in responses. We have multiple, it's a panel survey, right? So you can look at like, was your response 6 months ago consistent with your response today in the survey versus in social media versus the survey, right? And what we can show is like, people are pretty consistent on the survey, but the consistency sort of conditioning on the same amount of time is much lower between the survey and the social media posts.
Doesn't that indicate, I 8%, right? So that means 20% of the people are switching opinions each like way,
Well,
right?
absolutely. So there's not no survey differences, but there are much less. There's
So
much less
after like
consistency
5
between the surveys.
waves, potentially the entire population has shifted opinion.
It was not a consistent panel survey, so I go by into the details more, but most people we only have like 1 or 2 observations for.
Okay.
So I think
Okay.
I wouldn't sort of add it
I
up
see.
across. Okay, so I think what can we take from this? So one thing we can take is like actually, you know, we try to do stance detection, think about whether or not people are for or against particular topics. I think we have to be a little more careful about whether or not we're being too coarse-grained when we say like, are you for or against masks or lockdowns in particular? And so trying to get more fine-grained with some of these things I think is useful. I think the other piece is like, social media is what people are willing to say publicly. Now, the other side that we talk about in the paper, but that I don't have on the slide, is like surveys are also a conversation between the surveyor and the respondent, right? And so like on both sides, there's very funky social desirability bias. That's sort of different in each case. And I think it's important, right? So I'll come back to that last piece. Sorry, that was the last piece. But the sort of like high level is like, they're both different, but neither's like better or worse, right? They just tell us different things about behavior because we're presenting in different ways. We're doing it at different times for different reasons. And so like we really want to think about how do these two things complement each other. I'm gonna kind of skip this point, I can go back to it, but like what I will say then is like where this left us is like how, if you're, let's say now we're training a computational model to understand social media behavior, like how the heck do we know if we're right? So like if you say, even if I have survey data, if like the content of your message is clearly pro-Biden and your survey is clearly pro-Trump, I mean, intuitively it makes sense to say you're pro-Biden because that's what you say on social media, but then we have to be really careful about what we're claiming about the validity of our tool on social media. It's like we can measure your opinion on social media and potentially that's all we can and should say. Now, that's a super valuable thing, right? Because I think we sometimes get too invested in saying like, what is this person's true opinion? As opposed to like, what is the thing that this person is expressing to the people that follow them and interact with them? Because we know that social influence is a process. So this is not me claiming that we sort of should throw out stance detection as a tool because we can't say what someone truly thinks, but it is me saying like, maybe we have to think more about like what we're actually doing when we do those measurements. Okay, and so I'm gonna, I think you'll see in this, right, like this is an evolving process for me in that like, I really just wanna like measure identity. I don't care necessarily about identity on Twitter, but like I also have to be careful that to acknowledge that I'm not measuring identity when I look at identity on Twitter. I'm measuring identity on Twitter. So if I slip up and I'm not careful about that, just yell at me. But this is a collection of papers, some of which are with Sam and Michael here, on looking at what we can learn about social identity from Twitter bios. And this is, I think, the only slide that is actually from my thesis, which I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. I haven't worked that out yet. But what is an identity? Just to be clear, I mean like these words and phrases that we use to say who we are, right? And moreover, phrases that we use to say who we are that carry a meaning that at least some subgroup of us could agree on what meaning that conveys. Okay. So here is an identity. I am a father of two. That implies some things to some of you. This is still one of my favorite pictures because you can just sense the displeasure. It's like, let's just get one happy holiday picture together. And they were like, no. This is a year ago and things have not changed. And also, this is true. Like this older one saw these slides and he was like, actually, you're a father of three. So I was asked to put a picture of Josie in front. The little one's like sleeping in this is a disaster. I've never had a good picture of my kids. But I mean, just to preface, I think the other utility here is like, from like a computational modeling perspective, the difference between father of two and father of three is like, whatever. But like, if I come in here and I'm like, I only have one kid, as opposed to like, I have 5 kids, you're like, wow, like one of those is way more impressive. Like you're a much more impressive human being. And so like these sort of subtleties are like really kind of neat to think about how they affect our behavior, how the way we engage with people, right? And so you can ask like a set of questions here, right? So like, what are all of the identities that might ever exist in the world? Is an interesting question, I think. How are they distributed across society, right? So who gets to have a particular identity and who doesn't, right? So like that's one form of how we could conceive of structural inequality. What do identities mean? So when I tell you I'm a father of one, like that makes you think something about me. Like how do we quantify that, right? And then like moving on, then like how does that feeling that you get about me or that view or impression that you get of me then translate to how you act towards me? So like these are not the only interesting questions, but these are sort of the ones that I have sort of like tuned into to work on, right? And the hard part is that we want to do this, but identity is essentially a latent concept, right? So I don't like barge into a room. Well, I just literally just did barge into a room and tell you that as a father of two. But usually I don't like barge into a room and be like, you know, here is who I am going to, here's the social role that I am going to enact, right? It's implicit right now that I'm like the presenter and you're the audience. So like, that's why no one's like coming up and standing next to me, right? And it's like clear this is not like a wrestling match. So like, that's why we're not doing those things. But like, much of this is implicit and conditioned on like the environment, etc. Right? And so social media is neat because like actually it is a place where people do just kind of barge in and say like, here's who I am. Of course, this is strategic, right? Like I have a bunch of different identities. These are the ones that I choose to present because this is like a professional media for me, or it was. RIP. But like this is like kind of a neat section of social media that I am really interested in because it lets us not only think about like well, what are the identities that we present, but also like then how do different identities, for example, inform different kinds of behaviors, right? And so like not only do we not say a single identity, but we very, very rarely can like witness multiple identities that someone has in one place. So like it's a kind of a like, I don't know, the bio is sort of, in my opinion, like kind of overlooked, but like incredibly rich. And so we've thought quite a bit about this. The one catch is that like determining identities of social media users is difficult, right? So like there's the first question, like actually what is an identity? And I think like the social psych definitions kind of like start to break down when we start thinking about like compound identities, right? So like, is this whole thing a single identity or is it like two identities kind of jumbled together? Like, what would we consider to be the one thing there that we then compose into multiple identities? It's actually, I think, a sort of challenging question. And the other one is like, what do we do with things like this that don't fit this canonical definition of a word or phrase that we use to label other people that conveys a culturally specified meaning? What happens when, for example, like you just go straight to the meaning that you're trying to apply and you're like suggesting an identity but don't actually define a specific one? Okay, so the sort of work that the thing that we spent quite a bit of time on was just like theorizing like what exactly are these things, right? So the idea we came up with was a personal identifier, which is essentially just like things that signify an identity that we could probably name. Okay. And so this first paper that we worked on sort of came up with this idea of personal identifier, and we developed a very, very simple regular expression to extract out identifiers from the bio. And we spent a bunch of time trying to evaluate like how useful that thing was. How do we define it? Just qualitative work, sort of iterating with a regular expression. So we came up with a regular expression. We said like, what are these things that we pulled out? And then we iterated through both the regular expression and then trying to come up with our definition of personal identifier. Okay, so at the end, we have sort of this like concept of a personal identifier and this tool, which is, as you will see, imperfect, right? So like not all of these things are personal identifiers. Some of them, like this, is all probably like one thing you would want to pull out and it gets chopped up. So there's quite a bit of space. And I think Sam has done some stuff to think about like, how do we do better than just like a regular expression? But like we show in a couple of evaluations that this is like good enough. So like most of the things we pull out fit our definition of personal identifier, and we didn't miss all that many. Okay, so we can pull out these things. How are they useful, if at all? I'm going to just show kind of convergent validity, which is like this measure of someone's identity kind of lines up with what we would hope compared to other things we know about the people. So this, these figures, are using data that we have linked. We've linked Twitter users to voter records. So we have, for example, their age. So we can look at like what are the identifiers that the youngest people use versus like the oldest people. Seems reasonable, right? The other thing is we characterize status as I think like the ratio of followers to friends. You could argue that that is not the best measure of status, but I think it's close enough for this. Unlike again, like there's some dimension of status here that kind of plays out in these identifiers. Okay. So good, one thing we can say here is like, actually this can give us a sense of things that we care about without having to, for example, go through like problematic things surrounding linking Twitter users to voter records. Okay. I'd also argue that it can give us more, and I think I'm going to show a couple of papers where I think it's at least suggest this further. About one version of this that I'll give is like, if you look at people who in the voter records are Republican versus Democrat, and who self-identify in the voter records as Asian versus white, Asian is like a very broad swath that people identify themselves on voter registration, right? And so we can look at like, we can kind of get more fine-grained into people's identities and like what parts of their identities are meaningful for them and how that associates with different dimensions of meaning. Okay. Questions on any of that?
How much overlap are there for identities for different like accounts? Like how many different identities do you usually have like per account, and like how much do people overlap?
Sam, I'm gonna try to throw some numbers out and you tell me if I'm right. So Sam's paper that I'm gonna talk about now, we looked at, so the data set we had was, we took all of the users who tweeted at least once in the decahose from 2010 to 2016, like a couple hundred, like 400 million users, and collected their bios each month with some gaps because the server went down from 2016 to 2019, something like that.
Yeah, the beginning of 2019.
Which is a data set that we're trying to make available to others. I think of those, like 50 million were English, self-identified English bios, and had like kind of consistent collection. I think of those 50 million, you pulled out maybe 3,000 or 4,000 that were used by more than 1,000 people.
Yeah.
So
But the number of identities per profile definitely varies substantially.
But there are like thousands of unique like identities that can be
In the
tracked.
50 million, yeah.
Okay.
Right, so one of the things we can do is just ask like, what are all of the identities that exist? And how are they distributed across a polarized society, right? So the paper was really focused on like political polarization and like how identities kind of shifted over time. One of the things I think we did that was kind of interesting is, again, qualitative work to look at like what are the different sort of categories or types of identities that show up. Cultural and occupational identities are super prevalent. I think it's telling based on recent work in this space too that argues that like, so I think Kokil Jadka has a recent paper that argues essentially that like politics is a sideshow on Twitter. I have thoughts on whether or not that's the case, but I think nonetheless, at least only a very small subset of our population had any sort of explicitly political identifiers. I think it was 99.6% did not. Question?
Did you do clustering on these identities? And if so, did you find that it tended to fall within these categories that you drew or cross-cut the categories?
It's a good question. So I would say I've tried at various times to cluster the output from these. I think in one of the other papers we did. I think we haven't sort of published anything on that. That in part reflects like I'm still trying to figure out what exactly we saw. But I think one non-obvious piece to me is like Twitter is essentially bifurcated between people who care about news and people who care about like pop culture. And so like it's very hard to get beyond a clustering of that. And I do think that ends up getting reflected in these like, so like the cultural ones sort of like are very sort of insulated in one part of the network. But you do also sort of get to see like something of what I call like a persona. So like one of the clusters that I saw in some of the other work was like a yogi and a foodie and a photographer, right? And so I guess like that sort of lines up with these outdoor animals in culture. But I do think you do see some cross-cutting across the categories in the sense of like different personas that people want to present. You also see, and I'll talk a little bit maybe about this here, what Sam did was identify the left and right political identities and then basically try to measure for each category how those identities lined up with those over time. And you do see that there are like military, for example, military identities are like very strongly co-occurring with partisan identities. So you do see some of it, but that was a long-winded way of saying like, I don't think I have a good answer for that yet. So I won't go into too much detail about this other than to say like there was some interesting shifts across time. So like the way that people talked about their values and activism shifted in various ways. But also I think one of the takeaways is like social media is very polarized. We know that from a lot of work, but like it's a little less clear to me that that polarization really isn't like heavily determined by elites, right? And so like some of the things that I've been thinking about since this work and sort of like as this work's been going on is like how much we want to study like the regular folk on social media versus the elites, if we want to think about like things like polarization. I have a summary slide. Go ahead.
So when you talk about this identity expression, are you only focusing on the US context?
Explicitly only US context, I should have said that.
Okay. And because there are a variety of identity expression, do you have a sense about what kind of identity detection are more accurate than others?
No. Offhand, I would say we did, in the qualitative coding, the alphas were fairly high across all categories, but I don't have a good sense of whether or not we are biased in the classification across the categories. It's a good question. I'm gonna write down as soon as I'm done. Thank you. Other thoughts, questions? You want to add anything, Sam?
Well, yeah, especially by the categories was really hard to, like, we didn't even attempt to like train individual classifiers for there, but for identifier or not, we did train a model for that and it had like 85% accuracy.
Yes. So we don't know how the accuracy differed across categories. It's a good question.
Right.
Okay, I'm gonna sort of fire through two other things that we've done. One is like asking this question about what do identities mean? So what can we do here? Social psychologists, I think it's fair to say, either think about meaning of identities in like kind of a free association network or in like a latent space. And John Morgan, who is like somewhere in the ethos of Quesos, and I have thought a little bit about the relationships here. I think like the network people would say you can do latent space modeling of networks and vice versa. The gist here is like these aren't, in my opinion, like super different. And so like I'm gonna go with like this latent space. So like each identity, you can imagine some dimensions of meaning, gender, race, partisanship, affect, and you can like put each identity into a position in that space, okay? And the way we sort of typically do this is with these surveys, right? But like this is really hard to do. And so we can think about like, well, can we use the data that we have to like construct some of these meanings at scale? And so that is sort of one of the things that we have been working on. The details I think are interesting, but maybe not super pertinent at the moment. We fine-tune an expert model, and the gist is like you fine-tune with the assumption that identities that co-occur within the same bio have some similar meaning. And so what you can show is like if you do this and then you compare it with survey data, the fine-tuning is useful on the bios. Okay. The point I'm going to step back to is I just spent like 10 minutes previous I was like, hey, surveys and social media might not line up. And now I'm like, hey, I'm evaluating surveys and social media. So just calling myself out, that like, I don't know. I do think it's meaningful that these things are more consistent. I do think that there are things that have a shared meaning across surveys and social media, but like there is this gap, I think, in our understanding of that particular question. But at least we can show that there are more consistency in these measures than if you don't fine tune, right? The neat thing we can also do with these fine-tuned models, rather than surveys, is like now we can embed like entire bias. So I can think about like how does someone present, or what does it not only a single identity mean, but like when I convey myself to you through a bio, what is that telling me about you? Okay, and we can show that like again, like we're more consistent on that task than we are with these sort of fine-tuned models than we are on a non-fine-tuned model. I don't think that's particularly shocking, but I think it does tell us a little bit about how by sort of carefully constructing some of these data sets, specifically on identity, we can learn models that tell us more about identity, and those tools are useful. I do have an obligatory generative AI section of this talk. If you've seen enough of this, you can just tune it out. But like we've been looking at like meaning of identities or descriptions of people, and specifically Wikipedia bios and in other contexts. I just think this is like interesting. Like we're thinking about like, well, when do you convey gender in a Wikipedia bio? And so like one might argue that this statement, who just says you're born in the US on August 4th, 1961, doesn't convey gender, right? And indeed, like that's what GPT says. If you push GPT to give you a reason for it, it does give you a prediction that it's male, and it says, well, the historical political landscape, and you're like, yeah, that makes sense. And then you say like, actually, do you know what I'm talking about? And it's just, yes, because it's memorized Wikipedia. And so I think there are interesting questions that we can take away about like what conveys gender to me or to a, let's say, a unigram model that I train on Wikipedia is maybe very different from what it conveys to like one of these models that can memorize Wikipedia, putting memorization maybe in quotes for people who want to get super technical. And so I think there is this interesting line of work for like what conveys particular meanings to us versus these tools, and what does that tell us about how we think about something like measuring gender bias in one of these tools. Okay, I talked about generative AI. Okay. So then, right, the last part is like, cool, you can measure meanings, but like, what can you do with that? Okay, and just like as one quick example, we took accounts from the Decahose that had shared misinformation. So we're using the news card list for information quality. So low quality news sites. This is a case study. I think that there's fair arguments to be made that NewsGuard is not necessarily the perfect tool for measuring the quality of a news site, but I think it's good enough. There's pretty reasonable evidence that one, it's like pretty good, and two, it's pretty much the same as some of the other ones. I think that's Pennycook's work that says that. Okay, so we can take our bios, we can project them onto dimensions that we care about, for example, religiosity, age, and partisanship, and we can say, do accounts that present. So we're not saying whether or not you are right-leaning or left-leaning. Do accounts that present as left-leaning, right-leaning, older, more or less religious, share more misinformation? The answer is yes, and I think that moreover, there is a sort of multiplier effect on the age. So we knew that older people on the right share more misinformation. What I think we hadn't seen as much of yet is like just how much that gap, age gap widens as you shift. Okay.
Is there any chance that these features are just product of that like group being more active in general?
This is, I would say this controls for activity. It's like a rate.
Okay.
But yeah. And I think religiosity also, right? So like the religious right, and I think this is something that just continues to crop up in maybe your all studies of social media as well. But the religious right just seems to be like a very specific self-presenting religious right seems to be like a very unique subsection of social media that's probably worth studying. And last, we've asked some questions now about, okay, like we can characterize the identity of, let's say, a group of accounts, and we can also characterize the beliefs or attitudes that they express, like what's the overlap here? And so like how do we line up beliefs with identity to help us make progress? In this context, we were looking at the accounts who sort of signified they were Bernie supporters in 2020, and looking at like sort of the breadth of ideological variation and identity variation within this sort of like Bernie supporting group online that has been like, fairly or unfairly just sort of been lumped into this monolith of Bernie bros. Right? So like there's like a very rich identity and ideological landscape, and people who supported Bernie, some of them did appear to be Bernie bros, but others had, I'll show my political bias here, like some very nice ideas for the world. Okay, so closing thoughts. In terms of pontifications, like things we're thinking about and would love to think about with you all. Evaluation, perception of the evaluator, and self-presentation. I think I've alluded to this enough that I won't go into a ton of detail, but like, I think especially when we start to think about, not especially, I don't want to get myself into trouble, but like when we start to think about how to evaluate systems that are sort of presenting as humans in some sense, like how we feel about when they're right and when they're wrong is interesting. And I also think the sort of thing that I've harped on is like when we're right and when we're wrong in terms of like just comparing across different modes of data, I think is something worth thinking about. I think because there are differences in knowing something about someone versus knowing how they're presenting themselves in a particular context, let's say a particular media, I think how you present yourself is even more important if a lot of people are paying attention to how you present yourself. So I think there's a case to be made for like, we really want to focus on elites and their behavior and dig in there. And then finally, just like trying to think about like how we aggregate attitudes and beliefs into systems, or belief system is sort of synonymous in some sense with an ideology. And so trying to work towards thinking about ideology as a collection of beliefs is something that we're working on. What I've learned, I've tried for a while to say what I've learned since I left here, I just kids with an exclamation point. And I just, I've really enjoyed sort of working with folks who know qualitative work more, thinking across data sets and really trying to dig into this point of like understanding users as like strategic actors with agency and what that means for our measurements. So thanks to Sam and Michael who helped with some of this and some other folks, and open for questions, concerns, comments.
If there are any questions in the room, we can start with those.
Can you go back a few slides to where you fine-tuned the model to right here. So you said that something like foodie, you cannot really tell if it is like more leaning to left or right or something like that. So you did the co-occurrence of two adjectives to figure out the political leaning, right? So my question is, some of those, at least based on the number of appearances of each one, some of those appeared really few numbers of times based on a figure that you showed earlier. So my question would be, did you just run this, fine-tuned it based on the model, just assuming that whenever two appeared a few times in the data set, it means that they correlate with each other. It means that foodie, let's say that it was mentioned 10 times and 7 of them were mentioned by people who were left-leaning. It means that foodie is left-leaning now in the data set. Does that make sense? Did you use any like filtration or human intervention to filter out some pairs that do not make sense or do not actually align with each other?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I want to be kind of separate two things you said. So one is like these two studies were different. So like what Sam and I what Sam has worked on. And this stuff really was like looking only at the subset, like couple 100,000 out of 50 million accounts that had at least one political identifier. So this is really about looking at that subset and how they behave. Here, I think it's not so, right? So we're not making any assumptions about partisanship, whatever. We assume maybe downstream we want to project onto partisanship, but here we're just trying to align phrases such that phrases that co-occur in bios more frequently should be closer in the embedding space. It does turn out that partisanship is by far, I think, the sort of easiest dimension to identify. I think you're right that that's weird if I'm saying that there's not a lot of explicit partisan identifiers, but I think what is really sort of interesting and maybe telling is like there are a lot of things that are frequently, so you take the set of accounts that have a partisan identifier, there are a lot of identifiers that are also frequently there that people use elsewhere. So mom is a good example, right? So like mom is very frequently seen in Republican accounts but not in Democrat accounts. And so like there's a meta question here of like, what does that mean? That like moms on both sides of the political aisle, like so like the association between family and the right is like something we want to think about. But nonetheless, we should be able to then draw some partisan information from mom, even if for other identities, even if they don't co-occur with a partisan. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So, in the very beginning, you looked at how the survey data matched up with the content that they were posting and how that didn't always match up. Did you ever throw the profile identities into there as well and did a similar type of analysis using all three?
No, in short, we haven't thought about that. I do think that there's something there about like, there's a separate study there of like how well the voter records match with the identifiers. But I haven't done it. Like those are not always consistent and it's not clear where the error comes in. But I haven't ever studied it in any detail.
Yeah, I was curious on if you've presented a lot of this work on identity to folks like social scientists or more on the social scientist end of like computational social scientists like we do. And if they have like what comments or any feedback.
It's a good question. I think the closest I got, presented some of this at like a cognitive science outlet, which is like where this slide came from. Where is it? Wherever this one is. And then all they wanted to talk about was like this. So
I was thinking of this slide.
Yeah. It was like, so this paper is really about like how do we quantify the decision that you make to label someone. And what they really were engaged in was like, do we have the right signals here? And so, yeah, I do think there's still a gap. Like I can talk to the affect control theorists who like think of identity like this. But like more the cognitive social psych people who are still like kind of here. I think some of this is shifting with the embeddings work. So now they're wrestling with, they like embeddings. They want to use embeddings, but they still sort of want association too. But it is sort of somewhat still hung up on the sort of like representational semantics. It's been a while since I've talked to a sociologist, though ASA seems far.
Thanks for the talk. Please correct me if I'm wrong. You manually labeled the data, the survey and the tweets, yes? About the pro-Trump or pro-Biden who ended up with the 30% and 10%. By any chance, did you look at do you have any example or look at the examples of these cases to find out the reasons? Maybe the person changed the opinion during time and you were evaluating the past of the person, or maybe it's the result of the annotator bias.
So I think I'm fairly confident it wasn't annotator bias, just because we spent so much time and had so many discussions about this. And I think also the thing that I didn't talk about is like, we also had a confidence measure. Sorry, I'm pressing the arrows. But like, here. So we asked ourselves also like how confident are we in the decision? And like we looked at cases, again, like you're shrinking the pool every time a bit, right? So it's not a ton of examples, 30% of probably like 800 or 900 accounts. You're only looking at like 100 or so examples, but like virtually all of those disagreements were like, we were very certain of what we labeled, the survey said what it said. And so I would rule out annotator bias. I think that's possible maybe more in the lockdowns where it was really hard to decipher what someone was saying because lockdown's a multifaceted concept. But for Trump, it was like pretty clear to us. So I rule that one out. Time, we definitely considered. But again, you can subset to 20 or 30 or 40 examples where like they're roughly at the same time. And even if they weren't, we know people don't just like shift from Biden to Trump. And so like I think what we landed on is like the ways in which you want to talk to people who survey you and the ways in which you want to talk to your social media followers are different. Like to me, that's the most likely explanation. But I think that says like we are really have to remember we're studying context when we do these kinds of things.
Thank you.
So in survey study, people were very careful about who were being measured. And we know in social media, some people are old, some people are locked, right?
Yeah.
So even the population will be different. And over time, over long time, or even like depends on when you get the message, right? So I was wondering whether you have some thoughts about how we could pin down those population more specifically.
So like you're saying like it could be that the people who we are able to survey, these results would look different if it was a different population.
Depends on the time you were measuring, right? If you
Oh, I see.
happen to measure it on the weekday, day or night, or maybe in 2020 versus 2022, that population, like in X platform, that population already shifted.
Yeah, that's fair. Like I don't think, I mean, we have people who took the surveys and tweeted at a bunch of different times we could look. Like I can't speak at all to that generalizability. I think we might be able to look at it, but I can't say for sure what I would find.
Patrick sent a cool idea in the chat.
Oh, cool.
He said, I wonder if relational class analysis, Amir Goldberg talked about, could detect pattern discrepancies between survey responses and tweet stances. An example would be people who are pro-Trump in the survey are pro-mask, and people who are anti-Trump or anti-mask are prevalent with high frequency in your sample.
Yeah, we didn't really look at correlations across the questions. If what you're saying, Patrick, if you're still there, is that
Yes.
that might then predict who was inconsistent. That's super cool. I'm gonna copy paste that and bring that back. That's a good question. We didn't look at that. I mean, there was the correlations you would expect between the different survey items based on partisan attitudes, but we didn't look at if consistency there predicted consistency between the two. That's a really neat idea.
And then in terms of like the validity of the tweet-based manual stance coding, was there a minimum number of tweets that needed to be agreed upon for you to like use the tweet? Like were there some that were just so noisy it didn't really make sense to determine a pro and anti the given topic?
Was there some minimal? I don't think we threw out tweets. We always agreed, but we did have the measure of certainty, and we do say like the places where we were really uncertain also lined up with the places where like there wasn't a ton of overlap. So I'd say like we did have what we felt was like a sufficient sample size in each cell. And we did ultimately make a decision on each one, but we did compare that in the paper. There's quite a bit on like how confident we were in our annotations and how that correlated to agreement.
Oh, cool. Okay. Awesome. All right. Okay, I think we'll conclude. Thank you so much, Kenny. Thank you
Thanks, everyone.
everyone for coming.